An investigation into further possibilities for chord substitution in jazz blues. Research context. In the last few years I have begun experimenting with chord function and substitution in my own compositions and within my own improvisation. A degree of focus has come through my own teaching. Part of my approach to teaching harmony and in addressing what to play on particular chord types has been to use vamps or static chords. These modal vamps give students a focus on playing a single chord type with then as much time as needed to learn the chord, mode, scale, and within the scale the chord tones. I found it to be a thorough way to practice. It's then not a giant leap to play outside and create a language simply by inserting the chosen modal chord's functional altered 5 chord, and the idea then naturally expands into chord progressions. The blues has been my guinea pig for this experimentation, and in this video I will give a few demonstrations of my ideas. I've also experimented with taking some very common chord patterns used in jazz, like the common 2-5 altered tritone substitution, and using these as constant patterns around a 1-4-5. Let's take a listen to this idea. Chord changes don't seem to exist, which is strange when we consider the idea does not actually change anything. The chords remain in place, no chord types are substituted. That it's simply about inserting chords and then changing perspective. I see it as that, just gaining new perspective on each chord, making them 2 chords instead of being 6. 2 and 3, then each chord is now forced into being perceived, so perspective is changed as a 2. Before we examine this in detail, I'd just like to outline some of my research on this. I can't find this concept or this idea anywhere else. I've looked for some time, so I'm just like to outline some research that I've done and where I've looked. The real book does not have a tune that does this, has this chord sequence. I have 2 versions and I can't find a tune that does that. Mark Levine's very extensive The Jazz Theory book outlines approaches to blues excuse me, and jazz standards, obviously, dealing with approaches to the 4 chord in particular. This approach is not mentioned. Joe Pass's The Blues Side of Jazz instructional video looks at ways to approach the 4 chord, dealing with a half step above and below 251's obviously into the 4 chord, 251 as 4 resolution, chromatic rundowns to the 4 chord, approaching above and below, as I said, chromatic rundowns, tonal rundowns into the 4 chord. But this sequence, this idea of tritone subs as a constant, is I've not come across, and is not outlined in Joe Pass's material. There are 30 examples of blues turnarounds in Phil Capone's detailed blues study in issue 269 of Guitar Techniques magazine. None of the examples shown outline this sequence or approach the 4 chord in this way. Jazz professor and online guitar teacher at Electric Campfire, Mike Outram's Jewel Box series details ways to approach the 4 chord. This approach is not considered in his work. There are also now many very good guitar teachers online, like Jens Larson and Barry Green, who both post regularly along with others. I have looked at their work and found nothing on this topic, not found anything on this topic. I've searched widely online for some time and found no single mention of it. Corey Christian's Bebop Blues book, looking at bebop blues specifically, does not cover this concept. The chord sequence is not in the Charlie Parker Omni book. There is no mention of this approach in playing a blues in the extensive Thinking in Jazz book by Paul Berliner. The book covers has a lot of interviews and covers all topics in jazz, and lots of interviews with players talking about how they negotiate a blues, and this is not mentioned in anyone's approach. It's not in the Miles Davis autobiography by Quincy Troop. I've also asked a few jazz professors with decades of experience in jazz education and performance, and no one can give me an example tune. Let's look at these chords, this chord sequence, and how these chords interrelate from a theoretical perspective. So I'm gonna skip the first change, so the first chord in the sequence, and how we get to the 4 chord via that tritone sub in G and then arriving, so it's effectively 2-5-1 in G and arriving at D minor. I'm going to leave that from here because that seems to be the problem point, and I'll come back to it and address it in detail. So I just wanted to point out that the other changes that I don't see any problem with them, and I'll point out the reason why. So the 4 chord coming back to the 1 chord, D minor coming back to A minor 7. If we use a tritone sub, thinking of a 2-5-1 in C, so we play a tritone sub of G7, which that's sticking with my constant pattern, taking around the changes. So when we're doing that, we're only actually just playing a G7 altered sound coming home to the 1 chord in my sequence, in the outline sequence here, which is A minor, which is relative minor perspective. So there's no problem at all with coming from G7. You shouldn't have any problems coming, even hitting that 6 in there, but you know, resolving to a triad, it makes no difference. You know, when you're playing lines, maybe I'm not going to necessarily choose to resolve to the 6 when I'm playing into the chord, but who knows? It's jazz. You get what I'm saying, that the cadence itself is a very normal perspective to resolve to a. It's an interrupted cadence, or in jazz terms, jazz musicians call it the back door. So G7 resolving to A minor in this instance. So it's actually resolving 5-6 rather than 5-1. Okay, the turnaround. I said there was no problem with that. Well, the turnaround is very much like is a rhythm change in. This 3-6-2-5 is it's a very common language in all of jazz. You know, you won't find or play bebop or rhythm changes tunes or blues without coming across this. So it's standard stuff as a turnaround. And again, we arrive thinking of that as 3-6-2-5 common language, instead of my version of seeing it as 2 blocks of 2-5-2-5. It is 3-6-2-5. And then again, we don't resolve to C, we're going to resolve back to A minor in my sequence. So the turnaround and the 4 back to 1, I don't see any problems with those at all. Major 251 voice leading. You can see clearly we've got descending line on the top there, root notes. We've got a drone tone from the with the C there, flat third of the 2 chord, droning across the 5 chord. We've got the root of the 5 chord, now flat 5 sub, droning across to the 5th of the root chord, tonic chord. We've also got a descending chromatic descending line from G to F sharp on the top there. So this is standard voice leading in a major 251. If we look at my substitute D minor 7 or 4 chord and how this will then arrive there, we've got a descending line A flat. We've now got completed the drone tone across all 3 chords with the flat 7 of the D minor, the C droning throughout. We've got an E, D, A from the 5th, flat 5th, natural 5th. The drone of the D is obviously remains. It's now the tonic instead of the 5th when we've resolved to the 1. Flat 7 will now descend. Flat 7 of the 2 chord G drop into flat 7. F sharp was the 3rd of the 5 chord, will now drop to flat 3, which is an F natural. This is like a blues, because we've got a flat 7 in a G7. If I can make that work here. If we look at, and I have to play it like this, D minor 11, if I play a G, we can make that line work. So we've got an A flat descending to the 11th, then the G. We've got the C drone, we've got the D kept as a drone, we've got G, F sharp to F natural on the top as the flat 3rd. So we've got activity on every single line there, and we've got 2 successful descending lines, half step connections from the top, from the root and the flat 7th. I see D minor 11 as an inversion there of dominant 11th, so I can see that as G11, and you can see that clearly there. It's obviously the same notes, so you can see how those lines work, and it's descending then chromatically A flat G. Think of it simplistically as a G resolution. Obviously sus doesn't resolve, but you've got strong connections between those chords, and you've got to kind of play into a 4 chord anyway. Let's listen to some lines based on that. The minor 7 flat 5 chord is, for most jazz musicians, a 2 chord in a minor 251, or a 7 chord in a major key Locrian mode. I have, as previously mentioned, experimented and used substitute chords as home resolution points, and again this example takes a chord and tonicizes that around the changes of a blues, a simple blues. So the blues, again, for my guinea pig, minor 7 flat 5 chords. I've also not found this idea to be used before. common way bebop players address rapidly moving 2/5 is to ignore the 2 chord. Joe Pass talks about this in his instructional video and recommends doing so. It's quicker to think of the harmony shifting from dominant to altered dominant than thinking of 2 Dorian perspective, moving to Mixolydian, moving to altered. Here's another idea where this approach is taken, again as a constant pattern. There's a version on my YouTube channel where I use functional 5 chords, functional altered 5 chords into each change, but this version is concerned with using the concept as a constant pattern, again like the other example. Let's have a listen. Research into whether these ideas have been used before, a degree of analysis is required, along with the demonstrations of the concepts as audio examples. The methodology has been to first pose the questions, and the research has been to examine in theoretical detail and to practice, rehearse and record some examples. This will perhaps best demonstrate the viability or merit of each of these concepts. The potential impact of this work in the wider world, it has clear potential for me as an individual musician in further development of my original or unique voice within jazz improvisation composition. I also see this as having great potential in music education, as simple blues improvisation is where the majority of us begin our studies, particularly guitar players. For me, the blues is fundamental. It's the foundation of improvised music. I have for some time used a loose teaching method with my private students, centered around a course of study around blues, with blues as a thread, from simple blues scale, single scale approach to improvisation on static riffs or vamps, working through to addressing chord tones on vamps as I discussed, and then adding in more detail and cadence, and progressing towards challenging bebop blues. There's a clear thread for me, is this is genuinely how my playing has evolved over the years, and I believe these ideas are valuable outside of my music making in terms of jazz education or music education in general. Thanks for watching.